Well, we're starting a new series today. It's actually more like a continuation of a previous series. So if you've been with us for a while, you may remember that last year we worked our way through the book of 1 Samuel. And today we're going to start in 2 Samuel. But I thought the best way for us to start is to give you kind of a recap of some of the things that we learned. Because I don't know about you, but if it's been a while, I'm going to forget what happened and who's who. So I'm going to give you a little recap today of 1 Samuel. First of all, let me remind you, too, that 1st and 2nd Samuel are actually all one book. So when they were originally written, it was all one work. But it was divided into two books. Do you remember why? It's because the scrolls were too short to hold all of it. So they divided it in half. But it's really one story from beginning to end. And so I think it's a pretty amazing book. The story of 1 Samuel begins with the story of Hannah. And if you remember Hannah, she desperately wanted a child, but she couldn't have one. And she went before the altar of the Lord and she cried and she begged God to give her a child. And at last, God answered her prayers. And the result of that was the baby named Samuel. And so Samuel grew up in the care of Eli, who was a priest and judge of Israel at that time, because Hannah had promised that she would give her child back to the Lord. And so when he was old enough, she sent him to live with Eli and to help him be his assistant. And as it was then, Samuel grew up to be a strong man of the Lord, and he ended up becoming not only a priest, but also a prophet and a judge to Israel. Now, during that time, Israel had moved into the promised land. So you remember they were captive in Egypt, and then they wandered in the wilderness, and then they went into the promised land, which we know today as Israel. And so they were living there, and at that time they were governed by judges, not the kind of judges that we think of in a black robe behind a big desk, but their judges were more like governors or military leaders, some of them. But these were the ones who were anointed by God to lead the nation of Israel. And so Samuel was one of those. But if you remember, though, the people weren't happy having judges lead them. What they wanted was a king to lead them. You remember that? And they kept saying, but we want a king. And Samuel was saying, but God gave you judges. And they were saying, but we still want a king. And God says, but I'm your king. Why do you want anything more than judges? And they're like, well, all of our neighbor countries have kings. We want a king too, right? And then so finally God said, okay, you can have a king. But it's not going to be that great for you, right? And they said, we don't care if we want a king anyway. And so God sent Samuel to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. And I don't know if you remember this or not, but Saul was highly qualified because he was taller than everybody else, right? but he was also a little bit of a scaredy cat because, like, when they went to look for him, Saul was hiding behind the luggage. Do you remember that? And so he was pretty shy and wasn't really up to it. Nevertheless, this is who God chose. And Saul actually had times when he was very close to God and when he was empowered by the Spirit of God. The Bible says when the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. And so he was ruling Israel with God's help. There were times, though, when Saul forgot to look to God. And there were times when he made some pretty big mistakes. And so there was this one time when they were getting ready to go into battle, and he was supposed to wait for the priest to get there to offer a sacrifice, and he decided that he just didn't have time, so he did it himself, which was an affront to God. There was another time then when they attacked the Amalekites, and God said, I need you to destroy everything. Don't leave anything behind. But he allowed his men to save the best stuff, all the good plunder. Do you remember when Samuel arrived and he said, but didn't God tell you to destroy everything? And he said, we did. And then in the background there was a beep. And he said, well, who's that then? And they're like, well, we saved a few things, right? And this stuff kind of makes God mad when we're disobedient. When God says to do one thing and you do the other thing, he's not happy, right? And so God said, I'm taking my anointing off of Saul. And you can't be the king, and your family line won't be the king forever because of your disobedience to me. And so God began waiting for another king to arise. In all of this time, though, Saul was a very effective military leader, and he was conquering some of the peoples that were in that area. Because I don't know if you remember this, when they moved in the Promised Land, they were supposed to kick everybody out, and they didn't do a very good job of that. So they're always at war with these people who claim that that's their land, and then the Israelites are claiming it's their land. And so there's this war going on, especially with the group called the Philistines. And so this war is waging on between the Philistines. And in the midst of all of it, then enters this young man named David. And we see David when he's going to the front lines of the war to visit his brothers, and he goes up against the giant Goliath, and he takes him down with a slingshot. And so David was celebrated then. And then the king Saul brought him actually into the palace, because David was also a gifted musician. And he would come into the palace and play his harp, and it would soothe Saul's soul, because Saul was kind of tormented, right? Because the Spirit of the Lord was no longer on him. And then over time, David became this great warrior, and he led Israel into many victories against the Philistines and others, right? And so all the people started to celebrate David. And they would say, Saul's killed his thousands, but David's killed tens of thousands, right? And so not great when Saul is kind of an insecure, jealous person, right? So Saul got very jealous of David. And it's kind of weird, because there was like this love-hate thing, because he lived in with Saul's family, and he was best friends with Saul's son Jonathan, and he actually married Saul's daughter, Michal. And so they're very close together, but at the same time, Saul's trying to have David killed. And David ends up going on the run to protect himself from Saul. So here's this great warrior for Israel who's no longer fighting for Israel, really. He's fighting for his own life, and he's running to hide, and he gathers this following as he goes. And he ends up with about 600 what we call mighty men who served him and who traveled with him. But all the while, they're running and hiding from Saul, because Saul wants to take out David. And in the meantime, then, Samuel comes to anoint David as the next king. But nobody knows that at the time. And so David is on the run. He can't really step into his rightful role. And while he's on the run, there are two different occasions when he had an opportunity to sneak up on Saul and take his life. But he chose not to, because he said, I will not lay my hands upon the Lord's anointed. And so David knew that that was not his job to take out Saul. Nonetheless, he was still running, and Saul would be like, oh, thank you for not killing me. We're friends again. And the next thing you know, he's on the run after him again. So not a stable person, this Saul. So David and his men then end up actually going into Philistine territory. And they met with the king of Gath, and he says to the king, we want to live among your people. And we want to be here because we can't live with Israel anymore. And the king believes him. And so he actually gives them their own city called Ziklag. And he says, y'all can live in Ziklag with your families, and you fight for me. And so there David is. And every day David would lead his men out and go fighting, and he would fight against the enemies of Israel. And he'd come back and tell the king of Gath, this is where we fought today. And the king of Gath thought that he was fighting for their side, but really David was eliminating all of the enemies. It was kind of cool, but the king thought that David was on his side. Well, then the day comes where it's time for the Philistines to go and fight against Israel. And the king wants David to fight at his side. And this was a great moment of conflict for David. What do you do now, right? But then the king's advisors come up and say, you can't let David fight with us against Israel. What if they change their mind and fight against us instead? And so the king relents, and he says, you're right, go home to Ziklag. We don't want you to fight in this battle. And when David and his men returned to Ziklag, they found that their town had been raided by the Amalekites, who had taken off their women and children and their possessions and everything. And so David leads his men out against them to recover everything that was taken. And this is what David has been doing while the Philistines are waging war against Israel. And then they return home to Ziklag. And while this is going on, then, in the very last chapter of 1 Samuel is where you see the report of that battle between the Philistines and Israel, where Saul and his sons were all killed, and where the nation of Israel was defeated. And it tells you how it happened, and it's a sad tale. Saul had been shot by an arrow and injured by an arrow from the Philistines, and he was dying, but he was not dead, and his fear was of being taken captive by the Philistines because they would not have treated the king kindly, right? They would have used him as an example. And so he asked his armor bearer to finish off the job, to take his own life. And the armor bearer's like, no, I can't do that. And so the scripture in the last chapter of 1 Samuel says that Saul fell on his own sword. He took his own life to prevent being captured by the Philistine army. A sad ending to Israel's first king, don't you think? Not the way that Israel saw it, I would imagine. But here they are. And so as we look into 2 Samuel then, we see that there is a messenger bringing news of the battle to David. So if you want to read along, I'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. It says, after the death of Saul, David returned from his victory over the Amalekites and spent 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, a man arrived from Saul's army camp. He had torn his clothes and put dirt on his head to show that he was in mourning. And he fell to the ground before David in deep respect. Where have you come from? David asked. I escaped from the Israelite camp, the man replied. What happened? David demanded. Tell me how the battle went. The man replied, our entire army fled from the battle. Many of the men are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. How do you know Saul and Jonathan are dead? David demanded of the young man. The man answered, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the enemy chariots and charioteers closing in on him. And when he turned and saw me, he cried out for me to come to him. How can I help? I asked him. He responded, who are you? I am an Amalekite, I told him. And then he begged me, come over here and put me out of my misery, for I am in terrible pain and want to die. And so I killed him. The Amalekite told David, for I knew he couldn't live. And then I took his crown and his armband, and I have brought them here to you, my Lord. Isn't this a sad story? Israel was defeated and has no king. And here is this messenger who is ironically an Amalekite who was supposedly stationed with the Israelites. Remember, those are the ones that David had just fought against. And the good part about this whole story is that David had nothing to do with Saul's death. And that was a good thing, right? It would be good for the nation of Israel that David was not at all involved in what happened to Saul. And he stayed true to his pledge to not lay a hand on God's anointed. But this is not good news he's receiving. You might expect that David would have been relieved by the news, right? Because what this means is that David is no longer going to be hunted down by Saul. And now he will be able to go back to among his people and take his rightful place on the throne. I think that most of us in that situation would be a bit relieved, maybe even thankful. At last the chase is over and Saul is gone. But instead of celebrating, verse 11 says, David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard the news. They mourned and wept and fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the Lord's army and the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day. And then David said to the young man who had brought him the news, where are you from? And he replied, I'm a foreigner, an Amalekite who lives in your land. And he says, why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed? And David said to one of his men, "Kill him." So the man thrust his sword into the Amalekite and killed him. "You have condemned yourself," David said, "for you yourself confessed that you killed the Lord's anointed one." Perhaps this is where that saying, "don't kill the messenger," comes from, you think? But let's think about that messenger for just a minute, because he was probably expecting to be thanked by David. He probably thought that he was doing a good thing and was expecting some kind of celebration and maybe even a reward, because he had done this great favor for the king of Israel. But not only that, because now he alone was bringing the crown and the armband of the king to give it to David, as though he is himself coronating the next king. And I imagine that this messenger came and he thought that he would be accoladed, that he would be celebrated and thanked for doing this great act. He probably thought that he would submit himself to David in a respectful way and that David would hold him up in a place of honor. But that's not at all what happened, is it? And there's something to note here. His story differs a little bit from chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, right? Because in that report, it says that Saul killed himself. So we don't even know if this guy actually did that or if he just came upon the body and recognized the crown and took it in order to give it to David. But instead of celebrating, he found mourning. And instead of being honored, his life was ended. David avenged Saul's death with the Amalekite. And then, as he so often did, do you know what his next thing was? He wrote a song, because that's what David did, right? He's a worshiper at heart. And so we see, starting in verse 17, David's song for Saul and Jonathan. It says, David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It's known as the Song of the Bow, and it is recorded in the book of Jashar. Your pride and joy, O Israel, lies dead on the hills. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Don't announce the news in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice and the pagans will laugh in triumph. But, O mountains of Gilboa, there will be no dew or rain upon you, no fruitful fields producing offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty heroes was defiled. The shield of Saul will no longer be anointed with oil. The bow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul did its mighty work. And they shed the blood of their enemies and pierced the bodies of mighty heroes. How beloved and gracious were Saul and Jonathan. They were together in love and in life and in death. They were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. O women of Israel, weep for Saul, for he dressed you in luxurious scarlet clothing and garments decorated with gold. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies dead on the hills. How I weep for you, my brother, Jonathan. Oh, how much I loved you. And your love for me was deep, deeper than the love of women. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Stripped of their weapons, they lie dead. This is the song that David wrote. I love how David is so good at putting emotions into words, not just for himself, but for the whole nation. And also for us, for believers who would follow. He had this song taught throughout the land so that it would become a national way of grieving for Israel, so that they could process their loss together before the Lord. Oh, how our mighty heroes have fallen. And this kind of common grief is good and helpful in the process of moving on. Whether David knew that or not, it would have been a healing way for Israel to recognize their loss. And who better for that to happen than from the one who could have laid claim to joy in Saul's passing, but instead fell into grief? I think this tells us a lot about the heart of David. And I think he sets a powerful example for us on how to grieve a loss. But here's the big thing to me. He set aside his animosity. He set aside any bitterness that he had a right to feel. And instead, he chose to remember Saul for the good things that he did as a mighty hero. He chose to focus on what needed to be remembered about Israel's first king, that he was a brave warrior, that he brought prosperity to Israel, and that he was an important part of Israel's history. The nation was different because of Saul, and David allowed Saul to be remembered with honor, even though Saul had treated him like an enemy. I love, too, that David was honest about his feelings for Jonathan, a love deeper than that for women. And that doesn't mean anything inappropriate. That's the kind of brotherly love that we're supposed to have for one another as the people of God. It celebrates the kinship that he and Jonathan shared, the kind of love that endured through hard times and that was sacrificial towards one another. Sometimes we're lacking in that kind of friendship today, aren't we? The kind of friendship that's not self-serving, but that's there for the other. The kind that regards others more highly than ourselves. That's marked by loyalty and protection of one another, even though differences could have pulled them apart. David and Jonathan shared a genuine brotherly love. And that's not a weak thing, my friends. It's a beautiful thing. David loved deeply, and he grieved publicly. He was strong enough to show that side of himself. But what I think is the most admirable thing about this whole story is David's amazing capacity to be faithful to God through it all. Through the whole story, what we've seen is David being faithful to God. David being driven by his love for God. David treating others out of the way he feels about God. He demonstrated a character that reflected God's heart. Do you agree? David was submitted to God's anointing, not just on himself, but also on Saul. He respected that about Saul. And he trusted God's timing, and he put God's plan above his own, because a lesser man would have been looking for the way to claim the throne when he knew that he was going to be the next king. A lesser man would have been looking for, how can I take out Saul so that I can take my place in the palace, right? David didn't do that. Instead, he chose not to cause harm to Saul. He chose to honor him instead. Saul despised David. He falsely accused him and literally chased him into enemy territory in efforts to kill him. I wonder how we would respond to someone who treated us that way. But instead of fighting back, David stayed focused on God. And so instead of rejoicing when Saul was dead, David grieved. He saw the nation's loss and made it his own. Now, this to me sounds a lot like the teachings of Jesus. What do you think? Let me read to you from Luke chapter 6. These are the words of Jesus, starting with verse 27. He says, "But to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, offer the other cheek also. If someone demands your coat, offer your shirt also. Give to anyone who asks, and when things are taken away from you, don't try to get them back. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. If you love only those who love you, why would you get credit for that? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good only to those who do good to you, why should you get credit? Even sinners do that much. And if you lend money only to those who can repay you, why should you get credit? Even sinners will lend to other sinners for a full return. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to be repaid. And then your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will be truly acting as children of the Most High. For he is kind to those who are unthankful and wicked. You must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. You see, this is the heart of God, that we would love others so deeply, that we would pray for them and do good to them, even when they don't deserve it. And that doesn't mean that we should be weak or trampled on or not be able to speak the truth. But what it does mean is that in the midst of persecution, we can still decide to love the person who's persecuting us. That sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? Let me just say it again. In the midst of persecution, we can show love to those who are persecuting us. And you know why we can do that? Because that is the heart of God. Because there was a time when many of us were enemies of the throne, and God chose to love us anyway. Maybe the reason we know him today is because while we were still enemies of the throne, someone else loved us enough to tell us about Jesus. And so we should love those who hate us. That's not easy to do, is it? Anybody have a problem with that? Anybody have a hard time loving people who hate you? Yeah? Because you know what our instinct is? Our instinct is, well, you hurt my feelings, I'm hurt your feelings. You said something ugly to me, I'm going to say something ugly back. And that's just not among enemies. That happens with spouses, doesn't it? And sometimes it happens with best friends, right? You say something mean to me, I'm going to say something mean back, right? That's our flesh. That's our nature. That's how we want to respond to people. Yeah. You steal something from me, I'm going to steal something from you. You talk bad about me, I'm going to talk bad about you. You rude to me, I'm going to give you a cold shoulder. I am not speaking to you. You think my politics are stupid? I'll show you how stupid you are. That one was on my list because this week I actually commented on a political post, which I usually try not to do, but I said how I feel. And then down there's a guy responded to me who I don't know, right? And he said, this is something wrong with stupid people like you. And I really wanted to reply back. There was a part of me that even wanted to reply back with something really churchy, like I'll pray for you. But I didn't think that would go over well either, so I just let it go. Because you know what? I'm not stupid. And if he thinks I'm stupid, what difference does that make, right? It makes no difference to me. I don't care what you think about me. I don't even know who you are. But we can get so caught up in the moment that we need to defend ourselves, right? How dare you? How dare you say that about me? How dare you? How dare you accuse me of something that's not true? Let me come back at you. You see, that's our flesh. But when we belong to Jesus, we don't act like that. Instead, we show love to those who would do us harm. And I'm willing to bet that none of you have found yourself chased into another country by somebody who wants to take your life. If you have, come see me. We need to talk. I want to hear. But we can get so easily wounded, can't we? Sometimes by things that don't even matter. We can develop this mentality that says others are against us instead of for us. We can buy into the division that our culture wants to tell you is there, to that which the culture says makes us enemies, but we can come back and say, we're not enemies. Even if you think you are, I still love you. And even if you believe things very different than me, I can still love you. And even if you say things that are hurtful to me or that are intended to harm me, I can still speak kindness about you. Because that's the heart of my Savior. And maybe if somebody is against us, instead of focusing on what they did, we need to look for their woundedness. What is it in them that causes them to treat others that way? Because maybe they're just broken. Or maybe they're just mean. Maybe they need to see the love of Jesus. But whenever somebody comes against you, you have a choice, my friend. And you know what that choice is? Am I or am I not going to respond in a way that honors God? And that's right there at the moment. You have to make that decision. But here I would tell you, don't let someone else's evil trick you into doing something evil. If someone else is hateful, don't let that make you hateful, right? Because that is not who you are called to be. You don't have to fight back. You don't have to fight fire with fire. You don't have to run after them as though you're fighting some big battle for Jesus. You know what? Let Jesus be your defender, right? You don't have to worry if even what they're saying is true or not. Let Jesus be your defender. You don't have to call names or try to sway people against them. Instead, you stand in your righteousness because the one who knows you best knows your heart. Jesus said to do good to others, whether they deserve it or not. Because, here it is, your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will truly be acting like the children of the Most High. For he is kind to those who are thankful, who are unthankful, and wicked. Can we do that, my friends? Can we love people who are our friends deeply? And can we show love to those who are our enemies? God made every single one of them. And he wants us to show them love, not because it's our love, but because it's his love. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking about a certain person, you're like, I can't be kind and loving to that person. You don't know what he did. What I want you to know is it's not your love, it's his love that flows through you to that person. Okay? So if you don't have it in yourself, then you pray and you said, Jesus, I need your love in this situation because I ain't got it. But I'm willing to show your love. And that's what it looks like for us to be ambassadors for the King. And in the weeks and months ahead, we're going to be talking about the rise of the King and how David takes his place at the throne. But I think before we ever go there, it's important for us to note where he started, that before he reached for the throne, before he put the crown on his head, he took a moment to express grief in humility before God. He was humble, he was loving, and he thought about his country and the loss that they were going through before he thought about his own agenda. In Acts 13, Paul explains it this way. He says, but God removed Saul and replaced him with David, a man about whom God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Don't you want to be a man or a woman after God's own heart? The next time you have a challenging person in your life, whether it's in your family, or at work, or at school, or on social media, or in traffic, see if you can treat them the way Jesus would. Will you? Try to treat them the way David would. The way that God would want you to treat his creation. Not because they deserve it, but because no matter what they do or say, you will not be moved from being who God made you to be. No excuses. I'm going to treat people like you want me to, God. Let's go to him in prayer. Father God, we thank you so much for the story of David. We thank you for his example. And Lord, while we acknowledge that David wasn't perfect in all things, he was a man after your heart. And my prayer is that everyone who is listening to this message today wants to have that kind of heart, Lord. I want to have that kind of heart. Help me to see those who come against me as people who are created and dearly loved by you. Help me to see their pain or their insecurity or their brokenness, and to care more about that than I do about whatever pain they're causing me. Help me, God, as I face any kind of situation where there is division or animosity or somebody calling me stupid, to say, it doesn't matter what you say, I know who I am in Christ Jesus. And I am a reflection of his love. Help us to be good to friends and to enemies, Lord, because you made them both. We want to do your will, God. Would you put your will in us? We want to show your love. Would you put your love in us? Would you help us to live this out and not just think it's a good story, but let it guide how we treat others from here on out? We love you, Jesus. We thank you that you sacrificed yourself for us, even while we were still enemies of the throne. And we bring ourselves to you today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you'll stand.